Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Court of Public Fools. This is the podcast where we debate music and other pop culture references in a courtroom style fashion. I'm Alex. I'm going to be defending. Lam is going to be defending his argument. Judge Nick, you're ruling on these proceedings. So, Judge Nick, bring us into the courtroom.
Today, I will be presiding over the case of 80s versus 90s. Which was a better decade for music? Alex, you will be defending the 80s. Lam, you'll be defending the 90s. So if you're ready, let's get started. Court is now in session.
All right.
Alex, take it away.
All right. So I'm doing the 80s. So, first off, 80s music. I mean, you cannot start without talking about Michael Jackson, the king of pop. Like, he was the man. He was so good. They gave him a name of being the king of pop. Not just some guy, but the freaking king. So right off the bat, I want to start off talking about how great of an artist Michael Jackson is. I mean, Thriller is still one of, if not the top selling album of all time. The 80s, as you know, we all know, gave birth to MTV. Music was nothing until that happened. I mean, yes, you had the medium of radio and things like that, but now you are bringing music into a more live stream era where you could actually physically see the music and all the surroundings of what goes with the music. So it gave a visual to music, even though music was mostly a medium of audio at first. So I definitely think without MTV, I don't think music is what it became. Now, granted, MTV has gotten away from that music, but the way we observed music then would not be what it was without MTV. Even today, we still watch music videos. They just post them on different platforms now because of YouTube and the other avenues. I think the type of music that we had, if you throw on an 80s song in like a bar or something, you can instantly get a whole bar of people just singing the song. It does not matter what song. I mean, you throw on Welcome to the Jungle, you got like 10 or 15 guys just singing it at the top of their lungs if the spirit moves them. And I don't think that happens with any other kind of genre of music. And then I with 80s music, they tied in the super bands. And so
But you're saying the 80s only helped project the barroom anthem songs, like that was it. That you're not talking about Queen.
I mean,
the 70s. There's like the 80s were it. That's it. Everyone knows those 80s songs. They'll stand up and all sing along, and
I'm not saying like there aren't other songs that people do that, but I mean, there's so many to list. I mean, you throw on a power ballad, doesn't matter who it is, people belt, pour some sugar on me. People be screaming that at the top of their lungs. I mean, I don't have to say, I don't want to get into exactly where pour some sugar on me has made a clear, how can I say, keep it kosher, if you will.
Yeah,
but
it was
home.
Yes.
A clear home.
But I don't know if it was pour some sugar was a positive reflection of the 80s and something that you want to associate with that era, like as an anthem of we'll call it an anthem of sexism for what it was, so I think a lot of the 80s was reflected in that, with the hair metal, with stuff like those kind of anthems. It was it went down a wrong path in a lot of ways.
I withdraw my power ballad statement from the record, Judge Nick.
Okay.
Withdrawn.
So as I was
Strike
getting
it.
to get into as well, the super duos / the bands. I mean, you literally had Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson joining together to put songs out. Say, Say, Say. The Girl Is Mine off of the Thriller album was a duo of Michael Jackson and and uh, and Paul McCartney. I mean, those two are huge music legends, and to have them on the same track multiple times, I mean, that's pretty iconic. Um, then you had the Traveling Wilburys. So you had like, which was George Harrison, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, Jeff Lynne, the four of them getting together to put an album out. I mean, those are some
Bob
big
Dylan.
names in music. Bob Dylan as well.
Alex, you lose your turn. Lum, I want to hear some 90s points. For that, you lose your turn. Go ahead, 90s.
All right. Well, the 90s, I'll come out and say the 90s were totally different type of output than the 80s. I think the 90s were definitely more of a refined sound and less of the, I guess it was more identifiable with how the groups that came out wanted to create their own groups, create their own sounds.
Wait a minute. So we're
Like-
saying a refined sound. That's why like nobody knows the song, the lyrics to like Smells Like Teen Spirit and stuff like that, because all you just hear is Kurt Cobain just going wow, wow. Like, where's the refine there? I can't hear what they're saying.
The kids ate it up, and it spoke to them in a way that the 80s were. I will say the 80s reflected more of the global sound, the global setting of how people can come together and all this stuff. Which is great, but that's not what music also reflects all the time. Music has different facets to it. Like if you're feeling a certain way, or it speaks to you through grunge or hip hop or alternative rock at the time, Britpop. It just really carved out its own space in the 90s more so than the 80s. I feel like the 80s was just more concerned with making that global footprint, Live Aid, these big super groups, like you said, see who can they team up to sell the most records. They were concerned with selling the most records in the 80s, like reaching that global audience. But that's not how music should be defined. And I think the 90s did a good job of creating these pathways to different sounds that speak to the individual person, right? You got hip hop coming out of there with Tupac and Biggie, West Coast, East Coast sound, and alternative rock. The Pixies, Pavement, Pumpkins, Nirvana.
Yeah, but the hip hop scene of the 80s, I don't think they were worried about selling records. Yeah, they sold records, but I think they spoke to a greater movement of what was going on in the urban areas at that time. So like NWA, don't get me wrong, I'm sure they made good money, but I don't think that's what they were about. They wanted to let, the common people who might not have been aware of what was going on in LA, to let them know all the issues that they were dealing with. So I think there was some introducing of social issues there. I don't think it was just like, hey, let me just make a crap ton of money.
Granted. I mean, you're talking about hip hop in its infancy, coming out of the 70s and the 80s, right? You had a Grandmaster Flash coming out of the 70s, and then like Run DMC in the 80s and stuff like that. But Run DMC they were a fun hip hop group, right? They weren't,
the
Beasties. They weren't so concerned with the social, climate of where they were at the time. So you could go either argument. You do have NWA, like coming out of that scene, Compton and stuff, and other things. But you had the flip side with Run DMC and the Beasties and all of them just wanting to have fun and putting hip hop in a more like light manner, right? So easygoing manner. So yeah, I mean, that's why I think the '90s, you know, Tupac. You can't say that Tupac didn't write about social justice, which was, you know, predominantly his body of work was a lot of social justice issues. So I think they just grasped that sound and really made it its own, more so than the '80s did. So I I just think the '80s kind of were more concerned with image and like um, more concerned with their image than actual music. I mean, the talent was there; you can't deny the talent, but I felt like the image was equally, if not more important, on how they presented themselves in the '80s than the
Yeah,
'90s did.
yeah, but you can't say that the '90s was all about or '80s was all about like making money and stuff like that. And then you had like these giant concerts being put together that were literally just for raising money for charities. I mean, Live Aid alone. Then you had the Farm Aid, which was aiding U.S. farmers. So like Live Aid and Band Aid were both dealing with Ethiopian famine. And then We Are the World kind of piggybacked on that and just like famine in the world in general. I mean, those were, yes, they made money, but it was literally money going to charitable organizations, and so I think you can't say that they were about making money when clearly they put these huge concerts together, and the people that they brought into the concerts. I mean, Live Aid alone was basically U.S. and the UK, U.S. and Philly, and then UK Wembley, and then from that spawned side concerts under the envelope in West Germany, USSR, Canada, Austria, Australia. I mean, think about that. The USSR in the middle of the Cold War was influenced by a concert that was being put on in the United States. That's crazy to me.
It doesn't change anything that I've said about um, '80s being more about the global reach. Yeah, they definitely had a bigger footprint um, with obviously the politics at the time. They had a bigger pulse on that. But did it actually change anything? They had Live Aid. Like, how much of it did they actually change? Like, did they change the policies in Russia? Did they really take Africa out of hunger and famine? Like, did they change the course of that those countries on that continent?
I mean, Rocky ended the Cold War, but I mean, that was 85. But I don't want to get into that right now. I mean, that's not this kind of argument, but right. Just saying.
Yeah. So I'm just saying we don't know the actual metrics of how that all played out, but I'm just saying the '80s. I feel like the '80s were more concerned about the image of how everything was presented at the time, and yeah, they have a better pulse on the global scale, but that's not what music. If we're talking about quality of music, I feel like the '90s output though definitely dug in more, right? Like
yeah, but what resonated more? Like, so your argument is about like hitting more people, like was more global was '80s, and yeah, but like '80s music resonates. Like everyone knows '80s music. It doesn't matter how old or young you are, they know it. Like, and yeah, you'll see.
It's better though. Like, wouldn't you rather be singing Park Life in the pub than Journey constantly?
Like, but all right. So like,
of course, Journey resonates with everybody, sure. And karaoke,
I can walk into.
I'd rather be singing Blur songs, like the whole crowd singing Blur songs, than Journey. Like,
I could walk into a high school right now, and I can ask them who Michael Jackson is, and they'll know. If I say, and correct me if I'm wrong, Nirvana is probably one of the most iconic bands of the 90s, right? If you ask them who Nirvana is, and they all have their shirts with the little head and the two eyes and the like the little stupid face, okay? You ask them who Nirvana is, they don't know. They don't know who they are. They just know that they're the guy from Nirvana offed himself. That's it. Like they don't know, like they don't know that. Some of them don't even know that Dave Grohl, who ended up fronting the Foo Fighters, was the drummer for Nirvana, for crying out loud. I mean, people don't know that kind of stuff. Like the bands that you're talking about, people don't necessarily know who they are unless they expended outside the decade. Like Pearl Jam, people know who Pearl Jam is because of their longevity, not necessarily because of what transpired in the 90s. I'm not saying that Pearl Jam was good or bad or anything like that. Like, and I'm not saying that I don't listen to 90s music. I mean, I'm 45 years old. Of course, I'm going to have 90s music in there. But don't even get me started. Now I'm getting mad. Freaking Dave Matthews Band. I mean, come on. Like, you want to say talking about putting records out. I mean, Dave Matthews is the exact epitome of what you said was bad about the 80s. And they were smacked out in the 90s. Dave Matthews just grabbed a bunch of people together and was just like, I'm just going to put a band together and we're going to make money. I don't even know them.
I wish I had a counterpoint to Dave Matthews, but yes, there is one blight for every.
See, that should end his turn right there.
Decade of music. There's blights on every decade of music, right? So, but yeah, no, just going back to your point of your entry, your barrier to entry, as far as going back to listening to music and not knowing who Nirvana is. It's so easy for kids these days to open up a streaming audio and hey, what's this shirt at Walmart? Like, maybe I'm gonna plug it into YouTube or Spotify these days and find out who these guys are. Like, why are the Beatles so popular still? Why do people still sell out Rolling Stones concerts? You're talking about dinosaurs from 60 years ago, and they're still extremely popular. And you see young people go to these concerts still because they can pick up those eras of music at any point now. It's just the barrier to entry is just non-existent now. You can listen to a song in the span of like 3 seconds. You can open your phone and pull up any song you want. And a lot of these kids, I guarantee you, if you compare 80s to 90s, like they're probably gonna be streaming a lot more songs from the 90s just because the output and number of bands that came up during that decade was a lot more. The quantity was probably a lot more, and the quality.
You're telling me that a 90s band is getting more hits than the 80s bands are. You're telling me more Michael Jackson's getting, Journey's not getting more. I mean,
the big bands, yeah. But
Guns N' Roses.
The diversity and quantity of bands in the 90s, I felt like was probably triple. Like the amount of bands that wanted to make their own bands probably came up in the 90s more so than the 80s. Because the 80s was about big record labels signing only the most popular sounds at the time. But in the 90s, you had Sub Pop, you had all these smaller labels picking up unsigned bands, smaller garage bands, and these labels picked up hundreds of bands, and then they put all of them out there. And then you could go into record stores at the time, and with Amoeba, like, you can have warehouse full of all these bands that kind of came up in the 90s but no one knew about. So yeah, I think quantity wise there was definitely more output in the 90s. Streaming wasn't a thing yet, so you couldn't they're in that period where you had to still find a label, but you couldn't put it out on the internet at any point in the 90s just yet. So I think the 90s definitely, when I say it refined things, it kind of took that 80s and really branched off into like 100,000 different directions with all these bands that came up. So Yeah, I don't know. I'm just
All right. You both have made very strong cases. I applaud your efforts. Now, to wrap things up, we'll start with you, Alex. Give a couple points. Why do you believe the 80s was better? And feel free to make a point as to why the 90s was worse. Kind of wrap up what you said,
Well,
if you will.
I think first and foremost, like I said, first thing off the bat, Michael Jackson. I mean, he's the king of pop. Everyone, when you think of 80s, you immediately go to him, and he's literally the king of pop music. So to me, right there, I think is a big deal. I think the music, you can put on an 80s music on in any kind of environment, and people are going to know what that song is. uh, from you know, I'd say like anyone from like a middle school age kid and up, you can put 80s music on, they're going to know what it is, especially the iconic songs. And then the the amount of super concerts, super bands, and things like that was you can't you can't produce that ever again. It's never happened. I mean, when you look at We Are the World alone, the amount of people that are on it were unbelievable. Michael Jackson, Lionel Richie, Stevie Wonder, Kenny Rogers, Billy Joel, Bruce Springsteen. Those just to name a few. Whereas 90s, yeah, they had these. Everything was like little. It was niche though. It wasn't. It was niche stuff. So like not everyone was listening to the same thing. So like you had little pockets of people listening to this kind of music and this kind of music. It didn't like gravitate and resonate and get people unified and get them together. Not to mention that, like I mentioned before, the most iconic band that a lot of people resonate with the '90s is Nirvana. And what are they really famous for? They put good music out. I'm not saying that they didn't, but they're more known for their lead singer killing himself more than I would say necessarily their music. If you ask somebody who wasn't in the 90s at that point, they're going to know Kurt Cobain died. But they might not know what their music is, but they're going to know that he died. And I think that's what they're actually more famous for than the actual music. So I think when I think of 90s, uh, I don't think of music that transcends the generations and brings people together. And that closes my argument, Judge Nick.
All right. Lam, over to you. Why is the 90s better? And why is the 80s worse?
well, just going off your niche argument. Do you know when the first Skank and Pickle record was released?
I don't know what that band is. I'm just saying.
It's a niche ska band with the first record released in 1991. So that subgenre of that type of ska was in the 90s, which was also a um, subgenre with which is one of many subgenres that came out in the 90s. I could rattle off an entire list that could keep going, and that's what the 90s truly was a counterpoint to the 80s, right? So the 80s globalization music, which I would call it. So you're having all these offshoots with grunge, ska, Britpop, alternative rock, West Coast, East Coast rap, all this stuff that really spoke to that entire decade of music lovers. So, um, I just think the 90s really had a better handle of what people wanted to listen to at the time, and they didn't were not concerned with image and these super bands and having a pulse on like global politics as much. They took the music and kind of made it their own. Whoever wanted to listen to these subgenres, so um, I think that's pretty much But the '90s also had its fair share of icons at the time. Like I forgot to mention like Garth Brooks being uh, pioneer for the new country at the time, and Celine Dion and stuff. But so there were some of the larger icons at the time. So you can't negate that the '90s did not have any, but um, the '90s definitely took a lot of the sounds from the earlier decades and made it its own. So, and the '80s, I've already expressed that the '80s just felt like it was surface level music, more of an image thing, and it was a different time, different era for different politics and different emotions at the time. So I think I'll end my argument there.
All right. Those are great points. Now I'm going to take each point, go through it. Give me a minute. I'll come up with a ruling.
Garth Brooks. That was well done.
Mm-hmm.
You went there. You went to country.
Chris Gaines.
I went to the Chris Gaines.
That brings you down a little bit.
It was the
-7. -7. And to be fair, Bob Dylan was written on my list. He was just above the line that I had. So that's my bad.
So I will say you both did a great job. You did not make this easy for me. I feel like there's one thing that Alex, you didn't mention that I feel like would have helped your argument a lot. But I can't use it because you didn't make that argument.
Strike it out.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, I've come to my ruling. It wasn't easy. You both made great points. Lam, you made excellent points for the 90s. Things I never thought of, like with new subgenres were developed that just didn't exist. Alex, you also brought up great points with basically saying how we had those legends from years past also in the 80s, more so than the 90s. But Lam, I get where you're coming from about the money hungry and how it could have arguably been cash grabs. That said, I feel like I have to give it to the 80s with a slight victory.
That's right, baby.
Protection.
Court is adjourned.
Well, there you have it. I'm 1-0. Lam, suck it. I'm great. Thanks for joining the Court of Public Fools. Hopefully this will become a semi-regular thing. And we'll look to do this again with you guys sometime. So thanks for joining us. Peace out, everyone.
Later.